There's a very specific feeling you get when a news alert hits your phone and your brain just refuses to accept it. You read the headline once, then again, then a third time, slower, hoping maybe you misunderstood a word or two. That feeling hit millions of people at once today. Rob Reiner, filmmaker, storyteller, cultural fixture, and yes, forever meathead, and his wife, Michele Singer Reiner, were found dead in their Brentwood home. A violent, horrifying sentence that should never exist, and yet here we are saying it out loud. This isn't just Hollywood gossip. This isn't celebrity trivia. It's a family destroyed, a couple who shared decades together, gone suddenly and brutally. Friends and colleagues waking up to the kind of phone call that knocks the air out of your lungs. And before the shock even had time to settle in, before investigators could even begin to do their jobs, really, before grief could even take its first breath, the politics machine fired up. Every time I think about how low Donald Trump is capable of going, something happens to remind me that there really is no limit. The pit is bottomless. Hello, everyone. Happy holidays. You are listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. And this week, I'm really struggling to find that decency that I mention every week, particularly in politics. The main story is, of course, the tragic murders of Rob Reiner and his wife. In a normal world, on a normal timeline, this story wouldn't be covered on a political podcast. But we live in anything but a normal timeline, and the world is getting dragged down with it. Or so it seems on days like today. The latest example of which is the profoundly disgusting, not to mention inappropriate, Truth Social post by the President of the United States regarding those two murders. To say it's a new low for this laughable excuse for a man is putting it mildly. We're going to delve into all of that filth, that cesspool soon enough, but first let's hit some hot topics. For a lot of people, the words media merger sound abstract and boring and safely ignorable. Like something that belongs in the business section you scroll past on your way to the sports scores or the weather. But every once in a while, a media deal comes along that isn't just about balance sheets or shareholders. It's about who controls the stories we see, the news we need to trust, and the culture that we swim in every day. And that's where we are right now. This week, Senator Chris Murphy started talking publicly about the possible purchase of Warner Brothers Discovery by Netflix, and the competing, and reportedly hostile, bid coming from Paramount. On the surface, this looks like another round of corporate consolidation in an industry that's been consolidating itself into oblivion for 2 decades. But Murphy's warning is sharper than that. He's saying the Netflix deal would already be bad from an antitrust perspective, and the Paramount bid could be even worse, not just economically, but politically. To understand why, we have to slow this down a bit and strip away some of the jargon. Warner Brothers Discovery isn't just a movie studio. It's not just HBO. It's not just CNN. It's a massive chunk of American storytelling infrastructure. It controls film franchise, prestige television, reality TV, cable news, and a library of content that has shaped public imagination for generations. Whoever owns Warner doesn't just own entertainment, they own influence. Now, enter Netflix. Netflix is already the dominant player in streaming. It sets pricing expectations, it shapes release schedules, it decides what kind of stories get greenlit and which ones quietly die in development. If Netflix absorbs Warner Brothers Discovery, you're looking at a single company controlling a staggering amount of both content creation and content distribution. This is where the antitrust alarm bells start. Antitrust law, in plain English, exists to stop one company from becoming so powerful that competition becomes meaningless. It's supposed to protect consumers from higher prices, fewer choices, and stagnation. When Senator Murphy says the Netflix deal would be bad enough, he's pointing to the simple reality that fewer competitors almost always means less leverage for viewers and creators alike. If Netflix owns Warner's catalog, Netflix doesn't have to compete for HBO-level prestige content anymore. It owns it. If it owns Warner's film slate, it can prioritize its own platform and squeeze out rivals. And if it owns that much cultural real estate, it becomes harder and harder for new voices to break through. That's not theory, that's history. Every time we've allowed massive consolidation in media, the result has been less diversity, more homogenization, and fewer risks taken creatively. Fewer companies deciding what stories are worth telling is never a win for audiences, no matter how slick the interface looks. So yes, Murphy is right to be concerned about Netflix. But here's where the conversation gets a little bit darker. Because the alternative on the table isn't some scrappy underdog riding in to save the competition. It's Paramount, another legacy media giant, making a hostile bid that raises not just antitrust questions, but ethical and political ones. Paramount already owns CBS, one of the major broadcast networks. It owns cable channels, streaming platforms, and a vast content library of its own. Add Warner Brothers Discovery to that pile, and you're not talking about competition, you're talking about consolidation on steroids. But Murphy's warning goes beyond market share. Paramount's ownership and financing structure has increasingly tangled itself with politically connected billionaires, including figures who have been openly friendly with Donald Trump and his administration or aligned with his broader political ecosystem. And that's not a small footnote, because one of the crown jewels in the Warner Brothers Discovery portfolio is CNN. Yes, that CNN. The idea of CNN being folded into a media empire with deep financial and political ties to Trump-aligned interests should make everyone who cares about independent journalism sit up a little straighter. You don't need a conspiracy theory to see the problem. You just need a basic understanding of how power works. Owners don't have to issue marching orders to influence coverage. They don't need to make phone calls or write memos. All they have to do is create incentives, promote certain executives, reward certain editorial instincts, starve others of resources. Over time, the culture shifts. We've seen this movie before. Media outlets don't suddenly become propaganda machines overnight. They slowly learn which stories are welcome and which ones come with consequences. Self-censorship creeps in quietly, dressed up as business considerations or audience strategy. That's why Murphy's framing matters. He's not saying Netflix is good and Paramount is bad. He's saying the opposite of what we're trained to accept, that just because one option is worse doesn't make the other one acceptable. This is where his point gets uncomfortable. We're living in an era where people are constantly asked to choose the lesser of evils. To shrug and say, well, at least it's not that. Murphy is arguing that this logic is exactly how systems rot. If we keep accepting consolidation because the alternative is scarier, we eventually end up with no good options at all. And he's not alone. Other lawmakers and antitrust experts have been sounding the alarm for years about media concentration. They point out that when a handful of corporations control the bulk of what we watch and read, democracy itself becomes more fragile. Not because there's a secret cabal, but because power naturally protects itself. For average listeners, the stakes might feel distant. You might be thinking, so what? My Netflix subscription still works. And for what I'm paying, the more content, the better. But here's how this actually shows up in your life. Fewer competitors means higher prices. It means less pressure to innovate. It means more canceled shows and safer, blander replacements. It means news coverage that feels increasingly cautious, sanitized, or weirdly biased or timid around powerful interests. And if Paramount, if their bid succeeds, it means something else too. The growing risk that major news outlets become bargaining chips in political power struggles. Donald Trump has already demonstrated how aggressively he tries to pressure media institutions. He sues them, he threatens them, he publicly attacks them. Now imagine those institutions being owned by people who rely on his goodwill, his base, and his political machinery. You don't have to imagine direct orders. Influence doesn't have to work that way. It works through alignment. This is why the Paramount bid sets off a different kind of alarm than the Netflix bid. Netflix is a monopoly problem. Paramount is a monopoly problem plus a political problem. And that combination is volatile. There's also a broader context here that can't be ignored. We're in the middle of a generational fight over antitrust enforcement. For decades, regulators waved consolidation through as long as prices didn't immediately spike. That approach hollowed out entire industries. Media was one of the worst casualties. Now, finally, there's a renewed push to take antitrust seriously again, to look not just at consumer prices, but at power and influence and long-term effects. Deals like this are a stress test for whether that push is real or just rhetorical. Murphy's comments land because they force us to confront something uncomfortable. There may not be a good outcome here unless regulators are willing to say no to both options. That's a hard stance in a system addicted to corporate momentum. But sometimes the correct answer isn't choosing between bad options. It's rejecting the premise that those are the only options available. Media shouldn't be allowed to collapse into the hands of a few entities just because the market wants it that way. Democracy isn't a market outcome. It's a collective choice. So when you hear about Netflix versus Paramount, don't frame it as a horse race. Frame it as a warning sign, a reminder that who owns the story matters as much as what the story says. And maybe, just maybe, this is one of those moments where regulators are supposed to do the thing they were created to do, even if it makes powerful people uncomfortable. Because once the stories are controlled, getting them back is almost impossible. There used to be a basic understanding in American civic life that when you were summoned before Congress, you showed up prepared, you told the truth, and you understood that lying carried consequences. Not just political consequences, but legal ones. Career-ending ones in some cases. The kind of consequences that made people at least try to be careful with their words. That understanding, for all intents and purposes, is gone. This week, Kristi Noem testified before Congress yet again and made a claim that was both sweeping and false. She stated that the administration had never deported U.S. military veterans during ICE raids. Full stop. She said it with confidence in response to a direct question. She delivered it as fact. And then, in a moment that should have stopped the hearing cold, a veteran who had been deported to South Korea appeared on Zoom to confront her. Now, let that sink in for a moment. A man who served this country, a man who wore the uniform, a man who did what we're constantly told earns someone eternal respect and gratitude, deported, then forced to appear virtually before Congress to correct a cabinet-level official who had just erased his existence with one sentence. If that doesn't rattle you, it should. Because the most disturbing part of this moment isn't just that Kristi Noem was wrong, it's that she was wrong in a way that fits a pattern where officials show up to congressional hearings, say things that are demonstrably untrue, get caught, and then nothing happens. No referral, no perjury charge, no serious follow-up, just the next question, the next soundbite, the next news cycle. And that, I think, is the real story here. I mean, if we tried to keep track of every lie that someone in the current administration tells, we would never do anything else. But this isn't about relitigating every line of Noem's testimony. This isn't about parsing her exact phrasing or debating whether she misspoke. This is about a political culture that no longer treats truth as a requirement when answering to Congress. Once upon a time, being called before Congress meant something. It was supposed to be oversight, the legislative branch checking the executive branch. It was supposed to be one of the guardrails that kept power from running completely off the road. Now, too often, it's pure theater. Officials come in knowing exactly what's expected. They dodge, they deflect, they deny, they lean on technicalities, and increasingly, they lie. Not clumsily, not accidentally, but confidently. Because they've learned the lesson the system keeps teaching them. There's no penalty for doing it. Kristi Noem didn't invent this strategy. She's just participating in it. What made this hearing moment different was the visual contrast. On one side, a powerful official insisting something had never happened. On the other, a human being whose life contradicted that claim in real time. Not a statistic, not a report, a person. And yet even that wasn't enough to trigger immediate consequences. And that should scare us. Because when the truth can be contradicted by someone sitting right there, even virtually, and still fail to matter institutionally, oversight becomes meaningless. It's a joke. Congress becomes a stage instead of a check like it's supposed to be. And officials learn that accountability is optional. There's also something especially grotesque about this lie because of the person who it erased. We hear constant rhetoric about supporting the troops. It's practically a reflex in American politics. But when a veteran becomes inconvenient, when their existence complicates a talking point, they vanish. Not honored, not acknowledged, just erased. The administration will no doubt fall back on bureaucratic language, technical definitions, jurisdictional excuses. I mean, they always do. And those explanations may satisfy lawyers. It may satisfy some listeners. But they don't satisfy the basic moral question. How did a veteran end up deported, and why did a cabinet official feel comfortable pretending it never happened? The answer lies in power without consequence. When officials know they won't be held accountable for false statements, the incentive structure collapses. Why prepare? Why be precise? Why tell the truth when denial is easier and carries no cost? This is where Congress comes in, or rather, where it keeps failing. Lawmakers love to perform, their outrage. The sharp question, the viral clip, what they are far less enthusiastic about is the follow-through. Referrals, subpoenas with teeth, enforcement of contempt powers. all the boring, unglamorous mechanisms that actually make oversight real. Without those things, hearings become glorified press conferences, and we certainly don't need more of those. And administrations learn to treat them that way. This problem didn't start with Kristi Noem, and it won't end with her. We've watched it metastasize over the years across multiple officials, agencies, and scandals. The lesson has been reinforced over and over. Lie now, clarify later, or don't, and then just move on. And it's corrosive, because democratic accountability depends on a shared understanding that some venues still matter, that some statements still carry weight, that some lines, once crossed, trigger consequences. If Congress can't enforce honesty when somebody is under oath, especially when the lie is exposed in real time, then the entire oversight function collapses into a farce. And average people, I hope, notice. They should notice when officials dodge questions they'd never be allowed to dodge at work. They notice when powerful figures face fewer consequences for dishonesty than someone filling out a tax form wrong. They should notice when law and order somehow never seems to apply upward. That breeds cynicism, and cynicism is poison for democracy. The veteran on that Zoom call wasn't just correcting the record. He was embodying the cost of this failure. His presence exposed the gap between rhetoric and reality, between patriotic slogans and actual lived experience. And the system shrugged. That shrug is the problem. If Congress wants to reclaim any credibility, it has to relearn how to make lying uncomfortable again, expensive again, risky again. Because right now, officials like Kristi Noem are operating in an environment where truth is purely optional and consequences are barely even theoretical. This isn't sustainable. You can't have meaningful oversight if testimony is treated as improv. You can't have accountability if being caught doesn't matter. And you can't have public trust if people see over and over and over again that power just protects itself. The question isn't whether Kristi Noem will face consequences for this moment. History suggests she won't. The real question is whether Congress is willing to admit that its own impotence is part of the problem, and then do something about it. Because until lying to Congress carries real consequences again, we're not watching oversight. We're watching performance art. So even though the official quote-unquote deadline for the release of the Epstein files is the 19th of December, we already got treated to some, so to speak. There was a huge bunch of photos that were released by the House Oversight Committee. The photos didn't arrive with a bang so much as with a slow, sickening thud. The kind that lands in your gut once you realize what you're looking at. Not leaked selfies or rumor-soaked screenshots, but images tied to the Epstein files, released into public view with the weight of documentation behind them. They don't scream. They don't need to. They sit there quietly, daring you to pretend you didn't see them. For years, the Epstein story has existed in this strange limbo between what everyone suspects and what can be proven beyond a doubt. A convicted sex trafficker with access to staggering wealth, a social network that stretched from finance to royalty to politics, a trail of victims whose voices were, ignored, minimized, or delayed until it was convenient to listen. And hovering over all of it, a familiar defense offered by the powerful. I didn't know. I wasn't close. I barely remember him. The release of these photos matters because they make that defense harder to maintain with a straight face. Let's start with what these images actually represent. They're not a comprehensive record of Epstein's crimes. They're not proof on their own that every person pictured committed wrongdoing. That distinction matters, and it's one worth repeating. Appearing in a photograph with Jeffrey Epstein does not automatically make someone a criminal. Guilt is not contagious by proximity. But proximity does tell us something else about access, comfort, familiarity, and denial. These photos tell the story of a world Epstein moved through with ease, a world where powerful people didn't just tolerate him, but welcomed him, where doors opened and smiles were wide, and nobody seemed particularly concerned about who he was or what he was known to be. Among the most recognizable faces are people the public has heard about for years, and not because they live quiet lives. Former President Bill Clinton appears, a figure long linked with Epstein through flight logs and social events. Britain's Prince Andrew is there, whose association with Epstein has already detonated into public disgrace. Financiers like Leslie Wexner surface, and underscoring the moneyed backbone of Epstein's world. Familiar media and celebrity figures appear as well, people whose presence once raised eyebrows and now feels grimly unsurprising. Some of these connections were documented years ago. Others lingered in rumor and whispers. The photos don't manufacture new allegations. They solidify an old truth that many preferred to ignore. Jeffrey Epstein was not an outsider brushing up against power. He was firmly, comfortably inside it. And then there's Donald Trump. Trump has spent years trying to put distance between himself and Epstein. Sometimes that distance is polite. I knew him like everyone else. Sometimes it's hostile. I was not a fan. Sometimes it's revisionist, suggesting he cut ties early or sensed something off before anyone else did. The story changes depending on the moment, the audience, and the level of scrutiny. The problem with revisionism is that it collapses under evidence. The photos show Trump not as a reluctant acquaintance, but as a familiar presence, comfortable, smiling, at ease in Epstein's orbit. Not a man trapped in an awkward social obligation, but someone who looks like he belongs there, because at that time he did. Again, let's be precise. These images do not prove Trump committed a crime. They don't need to. What they undermine is the carefully constructed myth that Trump was somehow separate from Epstein's social world, that he was a passerby rather than a participant, that he was on the edge of a circle he was in reality standing squarely inside of. And then there is the photo that stops being subtle. The image of a bowl of condoms at Epstein's home, emblazoned with Trump's likeness and his name, is the kind of detail that burns itself into the public consciousness, or at least it should. Not because it proves an illegal act, it doesn't, but because it destroys plausible deniability. You don't get custom branded condoms bearing someone's name as a joke for a stranger. You don't display them casually unless that name carries meaning, status, and recognition within that environment. Now, let's sit with that for a moment. A convicted sex trafficker's home, a bowl of condoms, and the branding reads Trump, complete with the caption, "I'm huge." That's not a coincidence. That's culture. That's familiarity. That's a private joke that only works if everyone in the room knows exactly who it's about and why. And the caption? Well, the caption is the tell. Because if there's one thing the Epstein world understood perfectly, it was how to flatter Donald Trump. Status, ego, praise. Inflate the self-image and watch the doors open. "I'm huge" isn't just crude humor. It's a psychological strategy. It's saying the quiet part out loud. Everyone knew what worked on Trump, and they used it. You don't get immortalized in condom form at a predator's house unless you matter there. Defenders will rush to say it could be a joke, a gag gift, a tasteless novelty, and sure, it could be, but jokes also tell the truth about relationships. You don't joke like that about someone who barely exists in your world. You don't joke like that about someone whose presence looms large, socially, culturally, or personally. This is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about power. Epstein didn't collect powerful friends by accident. He curated them. He built a network that protected him, normalized him, and gave him cover. Being seen with the right people wasn't incidental. It was insulation. And the people in that network, whether they understood the full scope of his crimes or not, benefited from the association in ways both subtle and obvious. Trump fit into that ecosystem easily. He always has. Wealth, celebrity, public persona built on excess and bravado. He was not an outlier. He was a perfect match. What these photos challenge is the idea that Trump was somehow uniquely perceptive, morally ahead of the curve, or distant from Epstein's behavior in some way. They suggest the opposite, that Trump was comfortable enough in that world to be immortalized in its private humor. And this matters because Trump's defenders often rely on confusion. They blur lines intentionally. They jump from, this doesn't prove a crime, to, this proves nothing at all. Those are not the same statement. Evidence doesn't have to meet a courtroom standard to be meaningful in a moral or political sense. We are allowed to ask what kind of relationship produces that kind of artifact. We are allowed to question the sincerity of someone who now insists they barely knew a man who once treated their name as a household branding. We're allowed to notice patterns. Trump's history is filled with these moments where the record contradicts the revision, where photos, quotes, or documents surface that tell a much different story than the one currently being sold. And each time, the defense is the same. Deny, dismiss, attack the messenger, hope fatigue sets in. But fatigue isn't the same as resolution. For average listeners, this story can feel overwhelming. There are so many names, so many documents, so many timelines. It's tempting to tune out, and that's understandable. But the core question here is simple and human. When powerful people insist they weren't part of something ugly, and evidence keeps suggesting they were closer than they admit, who do we believe? We believe patterns. We believe consistency. We believe what aligns with reality. The Epstein photos don't exist in isolation. They sit alongside flight logs and social calendars and public quotes and years of reporting. Together, they form a picture that's hard to unsee once you really look at it. Trump didn't just cross paths with Epstein. He moved comfortably in the same social current, and no amount of post hoc distancing changes that. I'm not here to declare guilt where courts have not. It's about refusing to accept obvious falsehoods. It's about calling out the insult to our collective intelligence when we're told that what we see with our own eyes somehow doesn't count. A bowl of condoms with your name on it at a sex trafficker's home is not nothing. It's not random. It's not meaningless. It's a snapshot of a relationship that was close enough, familiar enough, and normalized enough to be joked about privately. That alone shatters the myth. So when you hear the next denial, the next distancing attempt, the next claim of ignorance, remember the photos, remember the branding, remember how ego works in rooms full of power. And remember that sometimes truth doesn't arrive with handcuffs or verdicts. Sometimes it arrives quietly in an image that says far more than anyone intended it to. That's where we are now. And pretending otherwise doesn't make it go away. And now, let's talk about the main story. News broke this morning, at least on the day of this recording this morning, that Rob Reiner and his wife had been found dead in their Brentwood home, victims of a stabbing. But let's start with the human part, because that's what matters more than anything else. Rob Reiner wasn't just a director with a resume people argued about on Twitter. He was part of the emotional furniture of American life. When Harry Met Sally didn't just entertain us, it shaped how people thought about love and friendship. The Princess Bride wasn't just a movie, it was a generational heirloom. Stand By Me didn't just tell a story, it reminded people what it felt like to be young and scared and loyal and hopeful all at the same time. These aren't disposable works. They matter because they give us an understanding of people. And his wife, Michele Singer Reiner, wasn't just the wife of. She was a producer, an advocate, a presence, a partner. Together they built a life that was creative and outspoken and, yes, political. They believed things and they said them out loud. And in a healthy democracy, that's supposed to be allowed. Instead, what followed this tragedy was something darker, uglier, and, sadly familiar. Before we get into the outrage, the commentary and the snark, let's ground ourselves in reality, because facts still matter even when they're inconvenient to someone's narrative. As of the time of this recording, Rob Reiner, 78, and Michele Singer Reiner, 68, were found dead Sunday afternoon in their Los Angeles home. The LAPD has classified the deaths as an apparent homicide, with the Robbery Homicide Division leading the investigation. Multiple reputable outlets report that their son, Nick Reiner, has been taken into custody and has been charged in connection with the deaths. That's it. That's the factual universe we are operating in as of right now. No motive has been established publicly. No cause of death has been officially confirmed in detail. No courtroom testimony, no trial, no verdict. Just the awful early stages of a criminal investigation and a family tragedy unfolding in real time. This is normally the part where public figures take a breath, where they offer condolences, where they acknowledge uncertainty, where they show, at minimum, basic human restraint. Normally, that's what happens. Instead, we got a Truth Social post that will probably be studied in media ethics classes someday as an example of what not to do when someone dies violently. Donald Trump, President of the United States, and current professional grievance dispenser, decided this was the moment to weigh in. Not with sympathy, not with silence, but with a screed that managed to insult a dead man, speculate wildly about motive, and turn a homicide into a campaign-style insult. You've probably seen the Truth Social post by now. It's everywhere. And I'm not going to read it verbatim, but if you haven't, I'll summarize the tone instead of rereading every line again, because frankly, it's exhausting. Trump suggested that Rob Reiner's death was somehow connected to what he calls Trump derangement syndrome. He mocked Reiner's political activism. He implied that Reiner's criticism of Trump drove people to rage. And then, in a final twist of the knife, he closed with a performative rest in peace. That last part is important because nothing says sincerity like insulting someone's mind, legacy, and humanity, and then tossing in a Hallmark sign-off at the end. This wasn't commentary. It wasn't analysis. It wasn't even trolling in the internet sense. It was cruelty written deliberately at a moment when decency demanded restraint. Let's talk about why this isn't just Trump being Trump, and why waving it off that way is part of the problem. First, the presumption of motive. At the time of the post, and still now, no one knows why this tragedy happened. Not the public, not the media, and certainly not Donald Trump. To imply that Rob Reiner's political beliefs somehow caused his own death is not just wrong, it's sick and reckless. It's injecting a political narrative into an active homicide investigation without any evidence. That's not free speech heroism. That's irresponsibility. Second, the tone. Even if you remove the political insinuation entirely, what's left is still appalling. This is a man and a woman who were killed violently. Their family will live with that forever. And the response was mockery. Not disagreement, mockery. That distinction matters. And then there's the pattern, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Trump has a long documented history of responding to tragedy by centering himself, attacking enemies, or reframing loss as validation of his twisted worldview. Mass shootings, natural disasters, deaths of public figures again and again and again. The instinct is the same. Exploit the moment. And now, without, electoral consequences hanging over him as a lame duck, without advisors who are willing to stop him if they could, that instinct just runs wild. There's another layer here that deserves attention as well, and that's the language itself. Words like mind-crippling, affliction, disease. These were all included in the Truth Social post. This is not accidental phrasing. This is dehumanization. It's the rhetorical move of turning political disagreement into pathology. Once you frame your critics as mentally ill, morally diseased, or irrational by definition, you don't have to engage with them. You don't have to respect them. And eventually, you don't even have to mourn them. That's the danger. Because when death becomes just another punchline, something has gone very, very wrong. If this feels familiar, that's because it is. We've seen this movie before, just with different victims. After mass shootings, Trump has often pivoted quickly to political grievance. After violent events abroad, he centered his own strength and foresight. After the deaths of critics, he's taken the opportunity to settle scores. The through line is consistent. Tragedy is never allowed to simply be a tragedy. What's different now is the volume and lack of guardrails. There's no campaign discipline, no plausible deniability, no attempt to sound presidential, just raw, cowardly impulse. And that should concern anyone who still believes that words from powerful figures shape norms, expectations, and behavior. Let's step away from the punditry for a second and talk about how this lands with real people. For some, the first reaction is shock because regardless of politics and regardless of this clown's history, most people still recognize death as a line that you're not supposed to dance on. For others, it's disgust because mocking someone who has just died, especially violently, violates basic human decency. And for a growing number of people, there's recognition. A weary, resigned recognition. The kind that says, of course he did this. And that reaction might be the most dangerous of all. Because once cruelty becomes predictable, it becomes normalized. And once it's normalized, it spreads. This isn't just about Rob Reiner. It's about what kind of public culture we are willing to tolerate. When powerful figures model contempt instead of compassion, it gives permission to everyone else to do the same. It teaches people that empathy is weakness, that grief is negotiable, that political enemies don't deserve basic human dignity. That's not toughness. That's weakness. That is rot. Here's what responsible leadership would look like in a moment like this. Acknowledge the loss, express sympathy. Say you disagreed with the person's politics if you must. But later, much later, or better yet, don't say it at all. Because death has a way of clarifying priorities, or at least it should. We talk about this not because it's shocking, although it is, but because it's revealing. It shows us once again who Trump is when the stakes are human instead of electoral. It shows us how easily cruelty replaces conscience when power is unchecked. And it challenges the rest of us to decide what we are willing to excuse. So yes, we wait for the facts. We respect the investigation. We hold space for the people who are grieving. And we refuse to let this moment become just another data point in the endless scroll of outrage. Because decency shouldn't be a partisan value. Empathy is not a weakness. And mocking the dead is not strength. It is craven, cowardly weakness. So despite the nauseous feeling that I've had for most of today with the goings-on, I still insist on trying to end these episodes on a high note. And I had to reach back a ways to find this one, but I found it. It was reported in January of this year, so almost a year ago. But what if I told you that sunlight, that big bright thing in the sky that we sometimes forget to appreciate unless it messes up our tan, actually solved one of America's long-standing civic embarrassments? No, I'm not talking about finding a renewable answer to climate change. I'm talking about something a good bit more humble, but just as important. Teacher pay. In Batesville, Arkansas, a small town with a big idea, solar panels didn't just save energy, they changed lives. Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter, well, of course solar works better than coal, hear this. For years, Batesville's schools struggled with the same thing most American public schools have wrestled with. Teachers are underpaid and budgets are tight. It's a cycle that's so familiar that sometimes it feels like we've accepted it as the status quo. Teachers work harder than most professions, often spend their own money on supplies, and still get paid wages that make it hard to stay in the job that they love. The district tried the usual cost-cutting tricks. First, energy-efficient light bulbs, better insulation, tightening up the HVAC system. Those moves helped a bit, but they weren't the grand slam solution. Then someone had the simple and bold idea. What if instead of just saving energy, we produce it? What if we stop buying electricity and start making it? So they installed solar panels. Not a handful, not a rooftop array that looks nice on the brochure. They put up around 1,400 panels in an unused field next to the high school and on the buildings themselves. That is a lot of photovoltaic goodness. Those panels now produce most of the electricity the district needs and have dramatically shrunk their monthly utility bills from around $17,000 a month closer to $4,000. That's real money. But Batesville didn't stop there because these panels sometimes make more power than the schools actually use. The district sells that surplus back to the grid. In other words, the sun isn't just lighting classrooms, it's paying dividends. Students might find that fact as delightful as they do when a snow day gets called. Let's talk numbers for a second, because this is where the story gets genuinely cool. And not just, hey, that's neat. Before the solar project, teacher salaries in Batesville averaged around $45,000 a year. Not exactly a figure that had local teachers doing cartwheels. Many educators took second jobs to make ends meet. It was harder to attract new teachers and even harder to keep the ones you had. But because of the solar panels and the savvy financial planning behind them, the district turned a stubborn $250,000 annual budget deficit into a $1.8 million surplus. No, that's not a typo. That's real money. Real money that became available simply by rethinking how energy is bought, used, and sold. And here's the best part. That surplus didn't disappear into some bureaucratic black hole or get swallowed up by more standardized test prep books. No, it went straight into teachers' pockets. Every teacher in the district saw raises of up to $15,000. $15,000 in a place where teachers had been struggling to make a living. A raise like that isn't just a pat in the back or a holiday bonus. It's transformative. It's the difference between scraping by and feeling valued. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from classrooms all over Batesville. Imagine being a young teacher who loves working with kids, but is on the brink of leaving the profession just to make rent. Now imagine being told, hey, thank you for sticking around. Here's enough money to let you breathe. That's the kind of news that doesn't just make headlines, it makes hearts lighter. And it's not just about cash. The district's shift to solar has helped make it one of the highest paying school systems in northern Arkansas. That's not a small footnote. That becomes a recruitment magnet. Teachers who may have headed to bigger cities or richer districts are choosing Batesville. Students benefit, families benefit, the whole community benefits. It's the kind of virtuous cycle that makes you wonder why every school district isn't doing something similar. There's even an educational ripple effect happening now. Batesville is designing a renewable energy curriculum so that students don't just benefit from solar power, they learn about it as well. They get hands-on insight into how renewable energy works, why it matters, and how innovation can solve real problems. That's the kind of lesson that you can't get from a textbook alone. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking, this sounds great, but solar isn't cheap to install. How did they afford that? And that's a fair question. And the answer underscores just how creative Batesville was. They didn't drain the school's operating budget to pay up front. Instead, they worked with energy partners and used financial plans that meant the savings paid for the panels over time. So there was essentially no crippling upfront cost to the district, but there was plenty of long-term gain. And here's the part that really warms your heart. Other districts are starting to take notice. Superintendent Michael Hester has said that at least 20 other school districts in the area are exploring similar models. It's the kind of news that feels like a ripple becoming a wave. What began as one rural school district's experiment with solar energy could become a blueprint for sustainable school funding across the country. So why does this story feel so good? Because it's not a feel-good story that flirts with hope and then leaves us hanging. It's tangible, it's practical, it's grounded in the idea that we already have the tools at hand and we're underusing them. Solar power isn't just some sci-fi dream. It's here and it's proven. And in places like Batesville, Arkansas of all places, it paid teachers more money. That's a sentence that should make anyone who cares about education grin. And maybe, just maybe, it makes you think differently about what innovation actually means in public education. You don't always need a new grant. You don't always need more taxes. Sometimes you just need smarter use of existing resources. Sometimes the sun can literally rise up and help pay bills. If this story teaches us anything, it's that good ideas don't need to be complicated or in order to be powerful. They just need to be courageous. They need people willing to say, let's try something different. In Batesville, that leap of faith didn't just pay off. It helped teachers see the value they deserve. And it showed the rest of us what is possible when we choose creativity over complacency. And honestly, that feels good. Not just for Batesville's teachers, but for anyone who's ever believed that public schools can be engines of innovation, not just places where problems pile up faster than the budgets can solve them. Here's hoping their sunshine-powered success story becomes something a lot more schools start talking about and emulating. All right, folks, thank you for taking the time to download and listen to another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. This brings the episode to a close. I'd like to once again encourage you to reach out. I'd love to hear from you, what you think, what your compliments are, what your complaints are, what your criticisms are. Whatever it is you have to say, you can contact the podcast using any of the social media platforms that are on the Linktree page, and the address for the Linktree page is in the episode description. You can also email the podcast at neighborotleftpodcast@gmail.com. I'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So, between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.